most women that I know, they've spent some time in academic sphere and some time in the Beit Midrash. There's a lot of fluidity and a lot of influence, I think, between these spheres. And I think that you can actually see similar kinds of questions that are beginning to develop both in the traditional world and in the academic world, which I wouldn't say that these are women's questions. I don't like to define them like that, but I think they are influenced by women just being less bound by a specific way of learning. Serious men will learn in one yeshiva with just, brisk type study for 10 years. Women have never had that privilege of staying in one space for so long. So they've picked up different questions, and therefore I think they often bring, questions that are a bit more existential or literary.
Uh-huh.
And this is gradually impacting both the academic sphere and the traditional yeshiva
It's
sphere.
really healthy. You have a broader perspective. This is Women's Gallery, the podcast where we showcase women defining Jewish leadership today. My name is Joanne Greenaway, and each episode I interview one incredible female leader making her mark in her own way on the Jewish community. We explore different models of leadership in the context of schools, shuls, universities, Batei Din, and more. Women's Gallery is an LSJS podcast powered by the Walder Foundation and a generous anonymous supporter. Before I start this week's conversation, I wanted to do an important shout out. A few months back, some of you will remember that I interviewed the extraordinary Rabbanit Michelle Farber, who founded Hadran, to bring Talmud learning to women online around the world, and she really started a movement. Hadran supports Jewish women of all ages, backgrounds, and skill levels with resources and inspiration to engage in Talmud study. I want you today to mark your calendars and save the date for something truly historic. June the 7th, 2027, that is when Hadran will host the second Women's Siyum Hashas in Jerusalem. It's going to be an incredible, powerful celebration of Torah. You will not want to miss it. And if you've ever felt intimidated by the Talmud, now is the perfect time to jump in. On June the 1st, Hadran is starting a challenge to learn Masachet Sukkah and encourage new learners to join in at a manageable pace. I'm going to put the link in the show notes, so do take a look. And I'm going to start it myself, and I promise you, Michelle is a wonderful teacher and guide. And now, to a conversation today with another wonderful teacher and Talmud expert, Dr. Ayelet Hoffmann-Libson. Ayelet is a senior lecturer in the Talmud department at Bar-Ilan University, an affiliated scholar at Yale Law School. She previously taught for 5 years at Reichman University, and she was the Gross Visiting Professor of Talmudic Jurisprudence at Harvard and also at Penn Law School. She is a scholar of Talmud and Jewish law, specializing in rabbinic law, the relationship between law and religion, and the history of Jewish law. She's also a graduate of the Advanced Talmud Institute at Matan, the Halacha programs at Beit Midrash and Migdal Oz, and has taught extensively at Drisha in New York and at Midreshet Lindenbaum, Matan, and Hadran in Israel, and is a member of the Beit Hillel Rabbinic Organization. She's the author of Law and Self-Knowledge in the Talmud, a book published in 2018, and is working on another book introducing each tractate of the Talmud entitled Gateways to the Talmud. It is really, really a privilege, Ayelet, to have somebody of your wisdom and knowledge and experience. And just because I know that you are a wonderful person, I'm excited to be hosting you and having this conversation.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I wanted to get straight in and talk about your journey. I really have a lot of questions regarding how you've come to do the work you do and with the choices that you've made. And I think about this a lot because learning Torah is an obligation that we have every day, or at least men definitely have that obligation every day. Whether women have an obligation today is debatable. Certainly it was always since the times of the Gemara. The interpretation of the pasuk in the Torah that you shall teach them was interpreted as men only. So that is in itself a big question, but certainly at least men have an obligation to study every day, but not necessarily to make it into their vocation. And many of us love learning, but you have really turned learning Talmud into your vocation. And I wonder if you could share with us, was there a moment that you realized that this could be not only a passion, but your day-to-day work?
So, you started by talking about, is there an obligation? You didn't raise the other side of the coin, which is that for most of Jewish history, women were considered not only not obligated, but actually forbidden to learn Torah. And when I look at my peers, I'm in my 40s now, and when I look at the women who I've studied Torah with throughout the past 25 years, I feel very privileged because I never felt that it was something that was kind of forbidden to me or even something that was very trailblazing in a sense. It was something very natural. I studied in an elementary school in Jerusalem where boys and girls studied together until 8th grade. And we all studied Gemara together from 4th grade. So it was very natural to me. And then I went to the Pelech High School, where obviously Pelech is a school in Jerusalem which really champions women's learning.
For those people who don't know Pelech, it was started by an English trailblazer called Alice Shalvey, who was an amazing person who passed away a few years ago, but really pioneered kind of feminist Torah education in Israel.
Yeah. So it's a school that, is both very religious, traditional, but also very feminist. And I feel like there wasn't even that much talk about what we were doing. It was just clear and natural that this is what we do. Women learn Torah. I mean, I think I only really looked into the issue of women's permissibility or obligation to learn Torah much later, somewhere in my 20s, when I had to teach it to other people. Until then, it was pretty obvious that, this is just something that we do. And I was blessed already in high school with really amazing teachers. One of the unique things about this school is that there were many teachers who were either doing their doctorates or rabbinical studies and teaching in high school at the same time. So we really had amazing teachers who went on to be luminaries of the Jewish world. I liked Talmud in high school. One of my Talmud teachers was Malka Pitilkovsky, who went on to be one of the trailblazing women who, she headed Beit Midrash Lindenbaum for a while. She wrote probably the first halakha book written by a woman. So she was very inspiring already.
She's many people's Rebbe. Unfortunately, her English isn't up to speaking on this podcast. Otherwise, she would have been here too.
Maybe with some AI tool in the future.
Yeah.
But the truth is that I found Talmud hard. Like, it's not easy. And I can't say that I fell in love with Talmud during high school. What I did fall in love with was a class that we had that had no grades. It wasn't even really mandatory, I think. And it was called Beit Midrash. And I just discovered how much I love thinking about kind of the big questions of human existence through Jewish texts. That was really my favorite thing. And I'm really indebted to my teachers, to Avinoam Rosnak, who went on to become a professor, and to Moshe Meir, who also teaches in many, many different places in Jerusalem, that they kind of opened up that experience to me. And it wasn't at all obvious to me that I was going to go into this professionally. For a long time, I thought I would do really different things. But when I look back now and I ask myself, did I choose the right path? Was there a path not taken that I should have followed? Then I always go back to these memories of sitting in the Beit Midrash already at an early age and just feeling like this is me'en olam haba. It's like being in the world to come.
It sounds very formative. And I've been there to that school, and I believe that Beit Midrash, or that Beit Knesset space, they say is the first space that was designed specifically for women only. It's a very inspiring place to learn in and to daven in.
Yes. One of my daughters just finished studying there, and I have another daughter there. And however much they complain, because teenagers do complain about school, I feel like it's really a privilege to be able to go to that school.
It's really interesting to hear about that journey and those opportunities. I'm sure there'll be many people listening who will feel jealous that they still today don't have the same level of opportunities or the same level of normalization of Talmud study for girls. Certainly other countries are way behind, at least that part of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
But it led you from learning in the Beit Midrash to becoming a Talmud academic, which also is not, a direct line. There are many other options open to you carrying on in the world of yeshiva seminary kind of learning. Academia is a different space. So I hear from many women who study doctorates, for example, because the more rabbinic path isn't open to them. Things are changing. We know some women just took the rabbinic exams a couple of weeks ago, Was that an option to you? You know, there's also the legal path. I went into law, and we choose from the range of options available to us. Was it clear that you wanted to be a Talmud scholar once you started thinking about careers, or did you think about law or rabbinics?
Not at all clear. In fact, when I finished the army in Israel, I took a year and I spent half the year studying Torah at Midreshet Lindenbaum and half the year studying art in Florence, because I was debating whether to go to pursue arts seriously or to go into Jewish studies. And I decided on Jewish studies, but originally I did not have such an amazing experience in university the first couple of years. And after 2 years, I decided I kind of finished up my BA quickly, and I went to study at Penn in Jerusalem in what was then the most advanced Talmud program for women. It was a 3-year full-time program. And I felt that, I'd really found myself. This is what I wanted to do. And I went into teaching in seminaries. I taught in high school for a couple of years, and I thought that my career would be in higher education, teaching in seminaries. And at the time, a formative teacher of mine at Matan said to me a sentence I'll never forget. She said, "Men have rabbi in front of their name, women need doctor." And that was really why I started pursuing a PhD, along with, a confluence of other circumstances that my husband wanted to do a PhD and we were going abroad. And I just thought, it would be a good opportunity. I was a bit overambitious, going with 2 children under a year and a half and
Wow.
thinking that, I'll just do a PhD on the side. So I really thought it was just going to be something that I did sort of on the side. And I think 2 things happened. First of all, it's amazing how quickly things change and how slowly things change at the same time. I remember when I was at Matan, so this was almost 25 years ago, I remember saying many times to my friends that if I had been born in Chutz La'aretz and if I was male, I would definitely be a pulpit rabbi. But it was kind of a joke because it was clear that that wasn't really an option. I'm Israeli. I'm planning on moving anywhere, and, there's nothing I can do about being female. So it was really not on the horizon. Then I feel very fortunate that I was actually, of this generation of women who went on to study halakha very seriously. And gradually women, became community scholars or all kinds of variations of being active in a community. But at the same time, I felt like things, on the one hand, were going very quickly, but not quickly enough for me. I mean, I could see that, it would take a long time for women to become real leaders and not have to constantly be belittling themselves or proving themselves in various arenas. And at the same time, I also had a very formative experience. We were living in New York at the time, and I did a graduate student fellowship with a professor from Cardozo Law School called Suzanne Stone, which was just a mind-blowing intellectual experience for me. And these 2 things happening simultaneously shifted my trajectory and made me become much more interested in academia.
I think we're definitely in a kind of transitional generation. And it's interesting what you say, that you saw the path that people were taking. And many women have taken these kind of paths as community scholars, yoetzot halakha, different kinds of leadership roles that pertain to rabbinic law. And you, even with your Beit Midrash learning, you chose to gain your credentials in an academic space. It's worth explaining to people, I think, that the field of Jewish studies in academia is actually quite different in its approach to Jewish learning. They have different goals. Jewish studies is more about studying Jews than learning lishma, like learning text for the sake of learning. And certainly when you learn text, you can explain to us more because that's what you do all day. But, learning within its context, maybe you can say something more about why you chose it and what the difference in approach is to you.
Yeah, so a lot of times people use the following metaphor to describe the difference between academic learning and traditional learning. Academic learning is more being an archaeologist. So it's looking backwards or digging down in order to understand the text that we have today. So for instance, to really understand the rabbis of the Mishnah, for example, we need to understand the context in which they were acting and behaving. So we'll look back to earlier sources from Second Temple literature or the scrolls that were discovered in the desert in Qumran. And we'll look at texts that are similar to the text of the Mishnah or the Tosefta and try to understand what the rabbis were responding to. So it's a way of looking backwards. And this is true of all academics, Jewish studies, that what we're really doing is we're trying to take apart the text that we have today and try and understand how it came to be. So that's true both textually and also in terms of the ideas, which is what interests me more. While traditional learning is more being a builder. So it's taking the text that we have and basically since the Tosfot, who were the first to really try and harmonize, to look at, two different texts that are standing in conflict and to harmonize them, that's really what most traditional scholarship tries to do, to try and take a variety of texts and put them together so that they can serve the observant Jew today. Because ultimately, they're interested in what do people do in halakha, right? So even if the learning is very, very theoretical, it has to be connected to what people do today. That's kind of, I think, the traditional way of looking about things. But I also want to point out a different nuance, which I think is really what led me to a large extent to academia. And that is, I would say, the difference between emet v'shalom, right? We have the verse, emet v'shalom, ehav, love, truth, and peace. But sometimes you have to choose what side you're on. Are you on the side of truth or are on your side of peace, of compromise? And I think that one thing that I felt many times in the traditional way of learning, and it's also related to what we just spoke about a moment ago about, my trajectory as a trailblazing woman in the 21st century, is that there's a lot of issues of compromise and of making things work in terms of, political considerations. And one thing that I really love about academia is that I feel that it's really about truth. It's really about understanding, what happened or what does this text really mean?
Something more purist about it. It's not messy.
Right. And having the space also to dig down, like in traditional learning, it's kind of the pace is much faster. And especially as a teacher, you have to prepare all the time and you don't really have the time to kind of really dig deep and think about all the implications of the text that you're looking at. And that's a huge benefit of academia.
But I wonder as a woman, because I often talk about how important it is that women are part of the conversation when it comes to building on rabbinic literature and getting involved in the halachic process. Our codes are fixed, but the interpretation of halakha continues. Mm-hmm. And whether or not that's something that all women really buy into or identify with, I can't say, but I wonder whether you have that same experience within the academic setting.
The experience of continuing to interpret, you mean?
Yeah, feeling like you're bringing women's voices into a conversation where women were traditionally erased.
Right. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think, when I look back, I think part of what drew me to academia was that in the traditional space, I felt that I would always be judged as a woman. And in academia, even though it's very rare to have women in Jewish studies, and particularly in Talmud, which is kind of, I would say the most difficult discipline within Jewish studies, you're judged on your own merit. You're not judged as a woman. So I think this question of, what does it mean to bring women's voices in? I think that, first of all, there's a lot of fluidity because the women's learning world is so small. And because for many women, there wasn't like a clear path of becoming a rabbi. I'd say most women that I know, they've spent some time in academic sphere and some time in the Beit Midrash. So there's a lot of fluidity and a lot of influence, I think, between these spheres. And I think that you can actually see similar kinds of questions that are beginning to develop both in the traditional world and in the academic world, which I wouldn't say that these are women's questions. I don't like to define them like that, but I think they are influenced by women just being less bound by a specific way of learning, right? So men, serious men will learn in one yeshiva with just, brisk type study for 10 years. Women have never had that privilege of staying in one space for so long. So they've picked up different questions, and therefore I think they often bring, questions that are a bit more existential or literary.
Uh-huh.
And this is gradually impacting both the academic sphere and the traditional yeshiva
It's
sphere.
really healthy. You have a broader perspective.
Yep, yep.
I wonder when we will get to the point where we see more women who have chosen the Beit Midrash route teaching in male yeshivas, and if that's something that would even be contemplated, because for those who choose that route, you see many women now teaching in seminaries, but you also have men who are teaching women in seminaries, and maybe that somehow demonstrates a lack of women who are reaching these heights of being able to teach, particularly Talmud, which is the most complex area within the world of Jewish learning.
Right. I mean, I think it's a bit of a vicious cycle, because I do think that at the moment there are very, very few, less than a handful of women who can compete with, the most talented men who teach in yeshivot.
If they haven't had 10 years in Brisker Yeshiva.
Right. But I also think that women won't be able to develop that confidence until they teach men, right? So there have been a couple of programs over the years. There was a program at Matan once that had, both men and women who have serious background, and they learned together, and then everyone wrote their own article or whatever. And I think that gives women a lot of confidence to see that, they have this kind of fear that they're never enough, but they're actually peers with men, then they discover that they're more than enough. They have much to contribute.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, it's interesting that you're part of the Beit Hillel organization, because these are networks where men and women who are involved in Torah come together as peers. Mm-hmm. And so you wouldn't necessarily have those kind of interactions to be able to discuss halachic issues, Torah questions, and to demonstrate your knowledge if it wasn't for networks like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about what actually developed my confidence over the years. And I think partly it's, my academic knowledge that I feel is very secure and gives me like a strong base of learning that, today I really do feel like I can compete with peers my age, because maybe I don't have the same knowledge in achronim that they have, but they don't have the same type of knowledge that I have. And I think that's given me a lot of confidence, but also being in shared spaces of men and women.
Yeah.
And realizing, we sit in the halachic Beit Midrash at Beit Hillel, and I realize I have things to contribute. I've thought of relevant sugiot that other people haven't thought of. And that, that's been a very important perspective for developing self-confidence over the years.
Yeah, it's really good to hear, because this whole question around imposter syndrome for women is something that troubles me so much. And I think some women feel that they have to be better than men to be able to demonstrate the value of having women in this field. And because they're so open to criticism or feel like vulnerable to criticism the whole time. But I feel actually the opposite, that one needs to put oneself out there to normalize women in these kind of positions, to allow for more people to come through. So even if you don't know everything, if you know enough to be able to teach or to be able to explain, then one should.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't want our listeners to think that I don't have imposter syndrome. I'm sure I still prepare at least twice as long for every class that I give as most of my academic peers or my rabbinic peers. I always say, I wish I just had that confidence to just get up without preparing and just stab. And, I'm sure the good things would come out, but I'm still not there.
Yeah, I don't know what the right answer is, because that frustrates me as well, that you should have to do that. But and it comes with the nature and personality, being conscientious as well. So you were talking about your experience in academia and how you had found that it was a space where perhaps there were less obstacles than in the yeshiva world, right? That people kind of judge you on your merits. I'm not looking for problems, but because you've worked in America and in Israel, do you find difference in the cultures from one space to another?
So it's interesting. I think it's actually sort of mirror images of one another. In academia, I would say that America is much more open to women, much more
Is it?
respectful, much more assumes that you have knowledge. In Israel, I feel like women still feel like they really need to prove themselves, which I think has to do with the fact that in Israel, you know, it's a small world, and I would say that most of the men have kind of traveled the same path. They've studied in the same yeshivot for the same amount of time, and they have this confidence that, and they're on a very, very high level also. So, there's a sense that you really have to prove yourself, I think, in Israel, in academia, that in America, I think it's more comfortable. It's less, it's more encouraging, more supportive. But on the other hand, I also teach a lot outside of academia in shuls, in public spaces, and in the Orthodox world, I think it's just the opposite. Meaning, in Israel's far more open to women leaders and women teaching, and they become something that's been really normalized. While in America, there's a lot of suspicion. So I'm writing this new book, and I started thinking about where to present it. And I was just speaking to some cousins who live in Florida, and they said to me, "Well, if you taught Tanakh, for sure our shul would want to have you speak, but Talmud, never. Talmud's considered really feminist."
Yeah, I think Israel really has a lot to teach most places in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, in that regard. And certainly I'm one of the people who look to Israel to try and import some of that culture, less denominational politics.
At least in the circles in which I move in Israel. I mean, obviously this isn't everywhere, but within, most of my friends are in the Beit Midrash world or adjacent to the Beit Midrash world. Their kids go to study, both the boys and the girls. They want their children to have equal Jewish education. And they're very supportive. And some of this even comes from men. Like, it's no longer about just women fighting to get, what they need. Obviously, in some arenas, yes. In with the Rabbanut, with the chief rabbinate, yes. But in our shuls, in our communities, you won't see a Shavuot tikkun, or you'll hardly see a Shavuot tikkun in my neighborhoods that there isn't at least one woman on the agenda.
Yeah, including for Talmud.
Yeah.
You also have this trend in Israel of secular teachers of Talmud, particularly in academic spaces like Ruth Calderon, who was very famous for standing up in Knesset and teaching Talmud as a secular woman, and the secular yeshiva. There is a blurring of boundaries, I guess, when you have secular yeshivot and then you have academia where you have religious and secular academics teaching in this area, and then you have your religious Beit Midrash as well.
Yeah, I mean, although you could argue that it would be more threatening, and because I think that's what happens in America, like there's a bit of a denominational threatening and this concern of who are we, and we need to preserve our borders. So you could imagine that the same thing would happen in Israel, but somehow it doesn't. Somehow it's just much more natural and much more understood that this is just something that's good for everyone.
So I wanted to ask you also about your writing, because you mentioned you're writing your second book, which seems to be more of a kind of populist type of style of writing than your first, which was more in academia. And I've spoken quite a bit on this podcast with various women about this whole need to populate our Jewish bookshelves with women writers. I am very proud of my Jewish shelves in my library at home, which is growing by the day. For generations and generations, every single book that we had was written by a man. So I don't know if that was like a key driver for you, like I need to write as a woman, or if there was a key message that you really felt the world needed to hear. Like maybe you can share something about your first book, like what's the key summary of that book and why you wrote it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, when you look back and you realize a lot of the things that you work on, even in academia, are kind of, there's an autobiographical thread there. So my book's about law and self-knowledge. And what that actually means is that I trace a development within Talmudic literature from earlier sources to later sources, where the earlier sources tend to rely more on experts' knowledges. So, the halachic knowledge or medical knowledge, but knowledge that's in the hand of experts who, are assumed generally also to be men. I mean, this isn't something that, I made a big deal out of because it's kind of obvious in the ancient world.
So you're saying within the Gemara, like the earliest, the Tanaim and the Amoraim, like the earlier generations,
right?
There's a difference between them and what came later. Or are you talking about Tosfot, Rashi, etc.?
No. I'm talking about within the Talmud. So like the Mishnah and Tosefta and Tannaitic literature, we see more of a tendency to rely on experts. And then I showed in a variety of different areas of law, in a variety of sugiyot, that later rabbis from Babylonia, from the Babylonian Talmud, are more interested in certain cases in the individual's knowledge. So it can be either physical knowledge of your body or knowledge of your psyche. So I'll just give one example. One of my chapters is on who gets to decide if a person should eat on Yom Kippur or not. And the Mishnah says, "Machilim oto al pi bki'im." They feed this person, a sick person, according to whatever the experts say. And I'm kind of really, abbreviating this now, but the bottom line in the Talmud goes in a different direction and cites the verse from Proverbs, "Lev yodea marat nafsho." The heart knows its own business. So that seems to be pulling in a direction that it's the individual who really knows, how they're feeling on Yom Kippur and can make the decision about whether to break the fast or not. So that's kind of a really nutshell example, but I show this development in many different areas of law. And I think that one of the things that kind of made me excited, this grew out of sugiyot that I had been teaching at the time at Midreshet Lindenbaum. And one of the things that excited me was that, we tend to think that individuality is something modern and that ancient religious systems are much more authoritarian, that the rabbis just want to establish their own knowledge, their own authority. And I thought it was really fascinating to find in these ancient texts that there's already an interest in the individual conscious, in knowing oneself, and that this is specifically in a religious text. So that was really, I think the kinds of questions that shaped my research, maybe more broader theoretical questions than I would have had if I would have had more of a traditional, going to yeshiva from age 15 to 25 and having more kind of classical legal questions.
I feel like I want to read it now, but I'm interested in your personal feeling because it sounds like the mission of the book or the statement you were trying to make is quite empowering, like a sense that people should have agency. And there is a lot of source material that demonstrates that it's important that people should decide for themselves. But is that what you think should happen, or is that how you genuinely feel as somebody who's very immersed in the study of Talmud?
I think it's very tricky. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that this kind of discussion within the Talmud does end up giving more autonomy to individuals than we're used to thinking of about ancient religious texts. But on the other hand, the borders it can be problematic. Like if you put everything in the hands of the individual, then how does the system continue to work? So one of the things that it didn't go into my book, but when I teach this, often I show how once you have two voices for example, in the sugya that I just discussed, you have the Mishnah, which is pulling more in the direction of expert authority, and you have the Talmud, which is pulling more in the direction of individual knowledge. Once you have those two values, then when you look at the Rishonim, the later medieval commentators, you're going to see constantly a kind of tug of war between these values, and each one will pull in a slightly different direction. So, that's what I think. I think that is what halakha is. It's a kind of system that you have to identify what are the values behind the rabbi's positions, and then try and understand how to balance them in each age and in each circumstance.
Yeah. Do you feel that it's important to bring those kind of debates, like that those debates are actually really important for us all to understand practically and can help us in the way we relate to our Jewish lives?
Absolutely, because I think a lot of times, I think one of the great joys of being more and more learned, of learning more Torah, is that you discover how complex things are, like things that you used to think was simple. I'm sure you know this also as someone who learned halakha, like the more you go into a topic, the more options and variety you discover that there are.
The more you know, you don't know.
That too. But I think that this is, that's really a lot of times what I try to do in my public teaching to complicate things for people, to show them that it's not that we have these rich, sophisticated worlds and, those texts were kind of something boring and it's just something we're committed to and we just have to do. No, like those texts are the most amazing, complex, value-laden disputes between the rabbis about how to live. And, that's what's so fascinating about them.
I really love that. And it leads me, I guess, to thinking about what you're doing with your book, because you have this new book where you're focusing more on a mass market to try, I assume, to really bring more people into understanding how to access Talmud, to look at the introductions. I've certainly found some of the material I've read of yours on this really, really useful. And I know that you also teach frequently for Hadran. You do some of their introduction sessions like before they start a new Masechet. But it's a very different approach to the more elitist type of approach that academia represents. So are you trying to balance both of those things within your career, or has this kind of mass access to Talmud become something that you're more and more leaning towards?
I mean, I think I always knew, we talked about when I decided to go into academia and how it was a bit of a surprise for me. But I always knew from when I made that decision, I knew I wanted to be a kind of public-facing scholar. So I've always, alongside my academic work, I've kept up teaching at Matan and in the community and, wherever I'm invited, and on Shavuot, I'm running from here to there and here to there. That's something that's really important to me. I think that academia worldwide, I'm not talking about just Talmud or just Jewish studies or just Israel. I think in general, the humanities have lost their way a bit in the sense of focusing on more and more highly specialized questions. And I think that that's really important to do as part of your training. And, I think that is what I did in my original work and in my first book. But I see academics as public servants, as people who should be bringing this knowledge to the community and to a broader audience. And so that's what I'm trying to do now in my second book, to write a book that's not just for academics. It's not going to cost, $100 and be bought only by libraries. But instead, I think it's a book that really has the potential for both for people who are serious about learning. Maybe I'll just say in a couple more words what exactly this book is. It's a book of each chapter is an introduction to one of the tractates of the Babylonian Talmud, so 37 tractates covering all of the Talmud. And in each chapter, I try to focus on one central idea, one central theme that emerges from this tractate. So it's not giving you an overview of everything that's in the tractate, but it's trying to give you kind of a bird's eye view of something that's really important and central and that's unique about this tractate. So I think both for people who are, serious learners, like for people who are doing Daf Yomi and going through the whole Talmud, this will be very useful. But also for people who just want to dip their toe in and, are curious, what is Masechet Yevamot about? What's going on in this tractate? And they just want to open one at a time and read these introductions. I think it hopefully will give people a sense of, again, like the values, the big questions. What is it about this text that made the Talmud one of the foundational literatures of Judaism and of the Western world? What are the big human questions that the Talmud speaks?
I'm excited to have it on my bookshelf. I think it will be such an important addition. And I wonder whether the key themes that you choose bring something new because you're a woman. And I ask because of the point about women being involved in the Talmudic and the halachic conversation, if you see women engage with Talmud in a different way. Like, are women bringing different questions? Are you choosing different themes that haven't been explored before? Like, is there a new approach there?
It's hard for me to say. I think that I could have written this project as a man as well. I sometimes think you need both ignorance and hubris to do a project like this, to write a project on the entire Talmud is something that perhaps like if you've grown up in a more traditional environment, you would never think that it's actually something that you can do because you're so used to focusing on details and on specific legal questions. And, you could write a whole book on a sugya of 3 pages, right? So I don't know, like maybe I think, I'll tell you what I really think that being a woman has impacted this book. This book, as you alluded to, has grown out of lectures that I've given for Hadran. And I think just seeing the feedback that I get from women and from men, but mostly from women, about, I had no idea about this area of law. And in a half an hour class, you've kind of given me an overview and given me a map to navigate this. That was really how this project started, as like something a gift that I can give to other people. So, maybe in that sense, it's directed by my experience with women.
I was thinking, the classic example, only a negative example, but often what I remark upon about women engaging with Talmud is the places where men talk about women, or men are very specific about women's experiences of their own bodies, and women can sometimes read that. Or I know when I first confronted it, it's quite challenging because it's like, what do they know and why was I not asked? So, from that perspective, coming into that conversation is really important, but there are many other examples that are more innocuous and less challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, it's funny because that's kind of some of the criticism that I've gotten from some people who have read some of the chapters of my book, that I'm so matter of fact about everything. Like I don't really go into kind of apologetics. And I think maybe as I'm working on it now, like I probably do need to do that a little bit more. But for me, as someone who's really like a bat bite in the world of the rabbis, I really feel at home in the world of the rabbis. I kind of don't notice that anymore.
Right, that really comes across.
It's like I don't really consider myself the woman that they're talking about. I feel
it's really refreshing because you're really on the inside. You're not coming at it as an outsider.
What I do all day is study Torah, just like they did, right? And obviously, like I'm an equal partner at home, and I have property. So in many ways, I'm just much more similar to the rabbis than to the women that they talk about.
Right. The paradigms that they create, you don't fit into. I love that. And I'm thinking how much your community or your connection to Torah, to Hashem, I assume is through the world of learning. And if we zoom out and think about women today, perhaps young women coming through and how they identify with their Judaism and their Torah, I think for many, the world of learning is more of a community than the world of the shul, where they may feel more excluded. And I can't speak for everyone, and I don't mean to generalize, but what advice do you offer young women who are coming through and trying to find their place institutionally, religiously?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that learning has to be front and center. I think there's also a difference, when you say young Jewish women. So, my daughter is 19 and she's finishing up her year in seminary in Midrash, and it's been an amazing experience for her. And, I'm sure she'll continue learning and it will be a serious part of her world. But I do wonder, what happens when she starts a family and she wants to find a community and a shul. And here I think that, even in South Jerusalem, we still have a lot of work to do. When I hear about a new shul being built and they're building the shul with a women's gallery, rather than thinking about women's access and being able to see the bima and, maybe being able to be close to their bar mitzvah child or whatever. Like, I feel like, those are the kinds of things that I think they need to just become obvious. Like, just like it's obvious today that girls go to a year at least, and maybe 2 or 3 years of learning, we still have a lot of work to do with regard to how to make communities really feel like they're inclusive of both men and women.
Yeah, and that's South Jerusalem. When we look at this on a global level, there's a huge spectrum and a huge amount of diversity. And Not everyone wants the same thing, of course, but there are also places that are increasingly kind of catching up and will need more education around some of these issues.
Yeah.
Do you feel any sense of hope? Like if you think about where we are and the women coming through, like where do you see this area or the space of women and Jewish intellectual religious leadership 20 years from now?
I definitely feel hope because, as I said, I think what's happened over the last 20 years is amazing, incredible. Even, several years ago, we were talking about the event of the women who just did the Rabbanut exams, and they filed the petition to the High Court 6 years ago. And at the time, it just kind of looked like something that, okay, like it needs to be done, but will this ever really happen? And now it's happening, and I think that the same thing, I think just what will happen is that communities will catch up. There'll be a mass of learned women who really take seriously their religious life, women who have had an amazing religious experience for a year or 2 or 3 in a seminary. And they'll just say, like, it can't be that this is so different from the rest of my life before and after. So eventually there'll be enough of a mass that shuls and communities will catch up.
Well, thank you for leading the way. It's been really eye-opening and inspiring talking to you, honestly. And I really get a sense that what you're doing, like you see yourself as a public servant. Like this is where academia and Beit Midrash really kind of exemplifies leadership. And I think you're having an impact on so many people right across the world. And we've certainly come a long way, like we mentioned right at the beginning about the Talmudic debate about whether women are obliged or whether women are allowed to learn Torah. And Rabbi Eliezer's comment about teaching Torah to women being like tiflut, right? He talks about this kind of licentiousness that people often quote. And it's kind of unimaginable to think from there to where you are today. So thank you for blazing the trail. And thank you for joining me on Women's Gallery.
Thank you.
And thank everybody for joining us. Really thank you for giving us your time today. Thank you for listening. Please do look for other Jewish learning opportunities with Hadran. There's going to be details in the show notes about how you can start the challenge to learn Masechet Sukkah. And also with LSJS, we have our Women and Mitzvot halacha course that I'm teaching on with other teachers that starts actually tomorrow on the 20th of May. And many, many other learning opportunities. So please do take a look on lsjs.ac.uk. And please do take a minute and rate the podcast. It's just a couple of clicks. It really helps others to find it and helps the podcast to grow. Thank you so much.